Kia ora koutou. My name is Mariana and I'm chairing the RECE Steering Committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education RECE webinar. I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people on whose land we are connecting today to this webinar. I want to also acknowledge all teachers, families, and children who are affected by the pandemic. And I want to acknowledge all our wonderful friends and colleagues on the screen or in the background who made this webinar possible. This webinar is organized and sponsored by RECE, the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education organization, which is focused on a critical approach to early childhood education and childhood studies. We also focus on scholarship and activism. And as an organization, we share a concern about privileging particular sets of beliefs or forms of knowledge or grand narratives that typically reflect Western or Eurocentric values, and that they can create power for certain groups of people and oppress others. RECE is a broad and welcoming international organization, and on behalf of the RECE Steering Committee, I would like to welcome you all to join us, visit our website, and become members. However, today we also mourn the violent loss of lives in Atlanta last week and affirm our support for the Asian American Pacific Islander community with whom we stand in solidarity. We condemn the Asian violence and the hateful rhetoric that has led to increased violence against AAPI communities across the US. Fighting racism, xenophobia, white supremacy, and sexism is critical in early childhood contexts with families and communities. We know this violence touches countless early childhood educators, children, and families. Reconceptualizing early childhood education is committed to creating just and restorative spaces for them. Today's RECE webinar towards racial justice in early childhood has over 750 registered participants from all around the world, the best attended event in 30 years of RECE. The chat will be disabled and all except speakers will be muted. Those who wish to interact with other participants following the planned program, please stay on and you can join our first virtual salon. Please save questions until after the panelists have presented, and then post in questions or raise your hand during the discussion portion. Please also note that this meeting is being recorded. This is the first webinar from a series of 3. Please visit our website receinternational.org in order to see details of others, become members, and support our vibrant community. It's my great privilege to acknowledge and deeply thank the Virtual Events Planning Committee, the amazing Lacey Peters and Beth Bruce Weidener, who are the coordinators for this event, and the planning committee, which includes the fabulous Sonia Arndt, Mimi Block, Janice Kroger, Rachel Langford, Margarita Ruiz Guerrero, and Marg Nagasava. And Jenna Goebel, making sure that everything works in the background, albeit I need to add it's Dr. Jenna Goebel, a stunning scholar. And a special thanks to Arizona State University School of Social Transformation and the event coordinator, Ginny Colette, for providing web hosting. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Margarita Ruiz Guerrero, who will introduce the panel addressing this timely and persistent theme of anti-racist practices in early childhood context. Dr. Ruiz Guerrero is an assistant professor at the Western Washington University, where she's part of the early childhood education and the education for social justice programs. She earned her master's in ECE at the University of North Texas and earned her PhD in ECE from New Mexico State University. Her 2019 dissertation, Nutrition in Early Childhood, a Black feminist analysis of Head Start, won the RECE 2019 Redding Jones Outstanding Dissertation Award. Her work connects theory to the lived experiences of students. She engages in innovative projects such as using gardening as a context for integrated learning. Her work engages with marginalized feminist perspectives, social justice, multicultural education, critical pedagogies, and bilingual education. Nami Hinui, and until we can all meet together again in person, please take care in these strange times. Dr. Margarita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. This is Margarita Ruiz speaking, and welcome to our first RECE 2021 virtual engagement. I'm honored to be here, and now I will introduce our wonderful panel who will be addressing this timely and persistent theme of anti-racist practices in early childhood context. Dr. Gloria Boutte is a Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. Her scholarship focuses on equity pedagogies. She is the author, editor of 5 books, and she has nearly 100 publications. She has presented nationally and internationally on equity issues and has received prestigious awards such as the Fulbright Scholar, Fulbright Specialist, 2020 National Council of Teachers of English Outstanding Educator in the English Language Arts Elementary Section, and the 2021 American Educational Research Association 2021 Division K Legacy Award. She's the founder and executive director of the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students. Dr. Colette has more than 30 years of experience in the early childhood education and care sector in both national and international contexts. She has advocated for a comprehensive diversity, equality, and inclusion approach in ECEC policy, training, and practice, introducing the anti-bias approach to the Irish ECEC sector. Dr. Murray is interested in transformative and emancipatory practice in education and care, and she has written and published primarily on social justice, diversity, equality, and traveler issues. She founded the Irish Equality and Diversity Early Childhood National Network. Dr. Evandra Catherine is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University, where her work includes research and policy projects focused on building more equitable learning systems for young children, particularly children of color. Her research is focused on reconceptualizing how early childhood educators support the emotional development of children of color, especially Black children, through practice-based coaching and anti-bias curriculum. Her dissertation focused on coaching early childhood educators to use emotionally supportive instructional practices to promote emotional development with children of color. Dr. Berman is an immigrant and white settler who grew up in Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat people, and is covered by Treaty 13. Dr. Berman is an associate professor and the graduate program director in the School of Early Childhood Studies at Ryerson University, and an adjunct member to the graduate program in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies at York University. Her research and teaching focus on race in early childhood settings, theoretical frameworks, in particular critical race theory, and feminist theories, and critical qualitative methods. Dr. Mariana Souto-Manning is a professor of early childhood education and teacher education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She serves as the director of the Early Childhood Education and Early Childhood Special Programs and is faculty affiliate and executive committee member at Columbia University Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Professor Souto-Manning's research examines inequities and injustices in early childhood teaching and teacher education, recentering methodologies and pedagogies of the lives, values, and experiences of intersectionally minoritized people of color, as she problematizes issues of colonization, assimilation, and oppression in schooling and society. She critically examines theoretical methodological issues and dilemmas of doing research with community of color. Welcome everyone, and thank you for sharing part of your amazing work with us today. The panelists will have 10 minutes to present their selected work. Please save your questions until after the panelists have presented and then post it in the Q&A option at the bottom. Welcome.
So thank you for that welcome, and thank you to the organizers. I am going to use "We Be Loving Black Children" as my theme for my comments. I intentionally use African American language, which is one of the most distinctive language varieties in the US. And across the world, there are lots of Africanized versions of English as well. This language system is very sophisticated. It has 5 verb tenses and other features that other languages don't have, like the word be. That be is called the habitual be. And so when I say we be loving Black children, that means that we love them in the past, we love them in the present, and we love them in the future. It is perpetual, and no one can make us not love them. We love them 7 days a week, 365 or 66 days out of the year, 52 weeks, 525,600 minutes. That's how deep we love Black children. So this is an unapologetic affirmation, a proclamation, a commitment, and a promise to Black children everywhere. Next slide. And this proclamation, we can go to the next slide, comes against the backdrop of the United Nations Declaration that the decade of 2015 to 2055 is the decade for people of African descent. You can go back one slide. And that is a global recognition of the humanity of Black people. You may take it back one slide. Likewise, the Black Lives Matter is also a way of speaking against the social injustices that Black people face in school and in society. And I'm going to be drawing from some of the work done by the American Education Research Association's work called Black Education, that book you see there in the middle. The next slide. So I really want to zone in on anti-Blackness. Anti-Black racism is the most pervasive, virulent, endemic, and dominant form of racism. Dumas and Ross define anti-Blackness as a particular disdain for Black people that is reflected in laws, policies, and institutions. And so it's a social construction that doesn't only focus on race and racism, but rather the antagonism in which Black people are, and Blackness is a despised thing in itself. And all over the world, we can see examples of anti-Blackness, even among different ethnic groups like in Latin America and Asia. There's colorism within and outside. And anti-Blackness is so powerful that many young Black children hate their skin color. And so Bettina Love has written about this, what she calls systemic institutionalized anti-Black state-sanctioned violence. And she says that what happens to Black children in school is that they are spirit murdered. Their spirits are murdered. They're denied inclusion. They're denied the protection that we give other children, the safety and so forth. They're humiliated and they are destroyed by visceral ways of being. Okay, next slide. Two of my previous doctoral students, Dr. Lamar Johnson, who is at Michigan State University, and Nathaniel Bryan, who's at the University of Miami, they actually unpacked that spirit murder a little bit. And they talked about some figurative bullets that Black children face, like disrespect, silencing, rejection, omission. And in another article that was done by Nathaniel and I, we just wanted to, and Lamar, we wanted to unpack what does it look like in school settings? And we identified 5 types of violence, anti-Black violence. Physical, you can click again, keep clicking on that one. Symbolic, curricular violence, linguistic, click a few more times. and systemic. You see in the picture, there's physical violence. Examples of curriculum violence would include inaccurate information, distorted information, like saying that African-American people were workers instead of that they were enslaved, attacks on our children's hair, their language, and so forth. And so it's endemic. And so what my work centers on is something called African diaspora literacy. Next slide. And this is derived from, it emanates from a Black studies paradigm. So even the earlier works of people like Carter G. Woodson and W.B. Du Bois, you can go back to that slide. Have talked about this whole idea of the need for anti-Blackness. And so if we think about healing, we used the work of African diaspora literacy to think about that. The term diaspora literacy was coined by Dr. Joyce King in 1992 in education. And I added in 2017 the term African, so we could focus on African diasporic people. And it's the process of helping people basically become literate about African people's epistemologies, cosmologies, cultures, languages, and ways of being. African people are about 20% of the world's population. Africa is the cradle of civilization, and yet it's understudied and disrespected. And so African diaspora literacy relates to people, African people, wherever they are in the world. So whether they're in the Caribbean or wherever, as you can see, the 6 regions of the African Union, people throughout the diaspora are included in this. And so we don't assume that African people are monolithic, but at the same time, African diaspora literacy acknowledges that there's a collective history and that socio-politically we're affected in similar ways. And so I just like for us to think a little bit about thinking about African diaspora literacy and thinking about loving Blackness as an antidote for the anti-Black racism and as a precondition for global humanity. Because if we can love Blackness and all, the thing that is most despised, then we can love other types of oppression that exist. So my work focuses on pro-Blackness. To be clear, when I talk about pro-Blackness, it does not mean anti-white or anti-anything else. And in fact, we stand in solidarity with Asian diasporic people and other minoritized groups. But pro-Blackness simply declares an unapologetic, positive perspective regarding Blackness and Black people. It's a declaration of unapologetic and revolutionary love for Black people. So it is the antithesis of anti-Blackness, which is the most dominant and insidious form of racism. And it's long overdue. And so the next slide, basically, this work is important for all children, including white children. Next slide. Because what happens in schools and educational spaces, white children are learning white supremacy and learning anti-Blackness. So very important that they learn to focus on and learn accurate histories and so forth. And so I do a lot of work documenting and implementing African diaspora literacies in P-12 classrooms. And the next few pictures just show you some examples of that. I work with a team of teachers at a center, next slide, across content areas, across grade levels, who are applying this work. They're multi-ethnic, multi-gender, next slide. And they have been applying African diaspora literacy in their classroom. And that's just an example of one of the first grade teachers teaching the content, but using an African-centric approach. Next slide. And next slide. And this is another example of a teacher who is, they created monuments to show tribute to the people who were brought to the US and enslaved. So my vision is to have pro-Blackness to be endemic. That's the next slide, please. Next slide. I have a picture of, no, you went too far, yeah. If you go back up to the mother with the child, the one more, two more back. My vision is that, one more, pro-Blackness is the norm in P20 settings. Go back, please.
Which slide do you want?
The one after this one. So I envision that Black children and Black mommies, that's a picture of my colleague, Kamani, went to Hort with her baby. She worries that her baby will be subjected to violence. I envision spaces where African diaspora literacy is being used to heal the children, where the policies and the pedagogy are pro-Black friendly, where teacher educators teach pre-service and in-service teachers pro-Blackness. We have 2 new courses at my university where we're requiring where people take courses on African diaspora literacy. And so that we center pro-Blackness in our research and our methodologies. And so, next slide, if we can envision a revolution of unapologetic, emancipatory love, and this is a picture of our new book, 4 editors, We Be Loving Black Children, Learning to be Literate about the African Diaspora. We wrote this book so that lay people can read it, and so that we could get it in the hands of as many families and organizations as possible. And so the next slide is a little preview of the book. If you'll play that, and then I'll just have one more slide. Technology fun.
We be loving
Black children.
We
Be loving
Black
Children.
We
be loving.
Black
children.
We
be loving.
Black
children.
We be loving Black children is an unapologetic affirmation.
a commitment.
A proclamation.
A promise to Black children and people everywhere.
We be loving Black children.
So just wanted to share that, and also just give a shout out, next slide, to some of my colleagues who are doing this work, Dr. Susie Long, Dr. Eliza Braden, Dr. Kamani Winter Hort, and Dr. Mir Muller. And then the last slide just shows you 2 other books. And thank you, and we apologize for the technological difficulties.
Good evening and welcome to everybody, and thank you for the organizing committee. I'm talking to you from Dublin, Ireland, in the lockdown. It's 7:30 in the evening, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. I've worked with the traveller community for the past 30 years as an activist, advocate, and ally, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that tonight. The title of my presentation is I've been locked down since the day I was born. And I will come back to that later, but to begin, for those who are not familiar with the traveller community, I will give you a brief overview, and then I will progress to discuss, racism and anti-bias in early childhood. But just to say that the demographics in Ireland have changed significantly with inward migration in the last 20 years, although there has always been diversity in Ireland. So yeah, next slide, please, Margarita. So the traveller community, they're a small Indigenous community with a nomadic tradition. There are about 30,000 travellers representing 0.7% in the general population. So it's a small population. A self-defining group with a rich culture and common characteristics such as organisation of family, values, language, social and economic life. While a distinctive feature of the traveller community is their nomadism, in the past 18 years, nomadism has been excessively regulated by the state, which has resulted in the criminalisation of travellers for parking on public land, and has essentially operated as forced assimilation. Next slide, please. Travellers experience marginalisation, exclusion at institutional and individual levels in society. So structural racism is part of the everyday life of travellers. It manifests in poor health and education outcomes and poor and overcrowding accommodation. Travellers experience the highest child mortality rates in the country. They have significant mental health issues, including the highest rates of suicide in Ireland. In 2016, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, in their assessment of Ireland, expressed several concerns about the experience of traveller children in Ireland. The committee noted the stigmatisation and social exclusion they experienced, highlighting their particular concern about the structural discrimination in their access to education, a persistent thread in the lives of travellers. And for this minority group in Ireland, an anti-traveller discourse is socially accepted and embedded. Hence, anti-racism work is necessary in early childhood training and practice. In 1998, while working in Pavey Point Traveller and Roma Centre, we began a process of introducing a contextualised anti-bias approach into the early childhood sector in Ireland, building on the work of Louise Dermond-Sparks to support and respect and recognition of traveller children. With strategic intent, we addressed policy, training and practice levels, working systemically, which we feel is actually really important and was really important in our context. There was little understanding initially, and it took some time for the work, especially the critical element, to be well received, and this of course is ongoing. In this type of work, things change very slowly, but there have been some substantial successes, including we have now a National Diversity and Equality Charter and Guidelines, which is a policy document, and it is accompanied by professional development, diversity and equality and inclusion training. You know, it's a short training, but it's a step in the right direction. The guidelines in the training ask critical questions. For example, they question questions that uncover our own discomfort, challenge our assumptions, and questions about who benefits and who matters, I suppose, in our practice. It's important to name the oppressed or the oppression which is manifested in traveller children's lives. That's very important. And I think the part about what Gloria said about the spirit being murdered, I thought was really interesting way of putting it, because that is our experience in education. If we grow up in a society where racism is accepted, I suppose we need to check ourselves every day. Next slide, please. So, however, recently, while reflecting back on that journey that I was talking about, it struck me how little has changed in addressing racism and discrimination in the past 22 years at individual, societal and service levels. Of course, there has been welcome movement in terms of policies, strategies and messaging, but how much has really changed in practice? In 2020, the European Fundamental Rights Agency, which reports and advises on human rights issues in Europe, found that Irish travellers have the highest rates of acute poverty, the lowest employment rates, and face some of the worst discrimination in Europe. In May 2020, the Black Lives Matter campaign became headline news when George Floyd was killed by the police in the United States. While there has been many shocking incidents of racial violence by police officers, this killing was a catalyst, an exemplar, which highlighted the issue of racism not only in the United States and globally, but including Ireland. Our Prime Minister at the time condemned racism, suggesting it is right to be angered by injustice. Racism too is a virus, transmitted at an early age, perpetuated by prejudice and sustained by the system. So there we have it, an acknowledgement by the state that racism is systemic. While the death of George Floyd ignited the conversation about racism, the endemic nature of racism against travelers has not always been visible or included in the discourse. For example, in the early childhood settings, there's been a tendency to address diversity in terms of the new cultures and English as a second language, and not addressing more critical issues such as racism and discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement has empowered and stimulated the Black community to speak out and report their experiences of racism, which are increasing, in fact, based on a report that was published yesterday in Dublin. And there is movement, for example, in society, and including in our university, which has just begun to support anti-racism training for all staff. We know that the early childhood sector is a microcosm of the broader society and can unknowingly perpetuate and normalize societal inequalities. No policy or guideline, however well developed, will make a difference on its own. The only way to achieve and embed change is to embrace the uncomfortable and begin with a critical reflection on our own values and attitudes in order to unpack how we perceive the world. How often do we do that, if at all, in our training programs in early childhood? Or how much time is given to that exploration? To be truly anti-racist or anti-sexist, it is my experience that it is necessary to unpack our own attitudes, assumptions, and discomfort when looking at diversity and equality, including racism. Learning and unlearning are part of that process. It is not enough to simply do inclusive activities, although they are really important. It is necessary to be aware of the big issues affecting those who are marginalized and discriminated against in society at economic, social, and political levels. This means recognizing the political nature of our work and moving towards a more transformative pedagogy. So what does that mean for the Ireland and the ECEC sector? We need to embrace an anti-bias approach which is grounded in anti-racism and anti-sexism and anti-ableism, etc., in pre and in-service training programs and subsequently practice. This work has been developed in Ireland and it needs to be mainstreamed in our sector. I believe this work has to be experiential and requires leadership and resourcing at policy levels, taking a critical stance. To get back to my opening quote from Winnie Collins, who is a traveller and a friend of mine. Winnie was talking to me about COVID last week, and she recounted that she had met a non-traveller woman in the shop who asked her how she was coping with lockdown. And she said, "I'm doing fine. Sure, I've been locked down since the day I was born." That statement brings home the stark reality of Winnie's life for the past 50 years. And that needs to change. This work is about alleviating human suffering. There is a moral requirement on all of us to begin and continue critical engagement with these issues. As we see today, it is really necessary. The social imperative for those who hold the power, make the rules, and distribute the funds is to create change through leadership, strategic planning, and resourcing for implementation. This is a prerequisite for our children, including travelers, acknowledging our interconnectedness and our humanity. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I don't have slides, so Margarita, if you don't want to share screen for me, you don't have to. I could just go full screen. It's up to you. Alrighty, so good morning, afternoon, or evening, perhaps. I want to start off by saying first, before I get into my work, is that what centers and grounds my work is that I'm the mother of a Black boy who once had an educational disability. And I say who once had because we started out with Part B 619 preschool, and he was able to exit off of his IEP by the time he had 4th grade. And I'll also say educational disability because I think often sometimes for people of color and for families, we really don't understand that some of these labels that we see are really for educational purposes. It doesn't determine their actual life and well-being and shouldn't be, but we know that that happened. And so I just want to start from that space and recognize that my son's best support was probably early intervention and the preschool special education program. And his occupational therapist was the best person on the IEP team. And I think that's because OT's philosophy really is to help people increase their life, their well-being, their participation, and their independence. And so with them focusing on the holistic child, that's what grounded me in my work and ensured that teachers moving forward, particularly early childhood education educators, would be successful. And so I am a postdoc with the Children's Equity Project, and our mission is to dismantle systemic racism in learning settings and sort of close opportunity gaps so that all children can thrive. Our work's at the intersection of research, practice, and policies, and we focus on a range of issues to include discipline, the inclusion of children with disabilities, immigration and early childhood issues, tribal issues, and dual language issues. For today, I will be speaking to discipline and inclusion of children with disabilities and children of color. The way that we approach our work is we use the Racial Equity Institute's groundwater approach or metaphor, where it's the fish, the lake, and the groundwater. And what we've often seen is that interventions always seem to target the fish as opposed to understanding the lake, but then going deeper into systems and understanding that that lake is being supplied water from groundwater. And that is where we see a lot of systemic racism in our systems. It's actually in the groundwater, which is poisoning our lake, which is poisoning our fish. And so what I'm going to start with first is like, it's not about what you say and it's how you say it. So I'm just going to read 2 statements that state something totally different, but they sound very similar. The first one is young children with behavior problems also tend to have a variety of social emotional deficits. Or young children with social emotional deficits tend to have a variety of behavior problems. So it's all about where we see the problem, whether it's the fish, the lake, or the groundwater. And we always want to look at the groundwater as some of these systemic problems, especially systemic racism. So for harsh discipline, the Children's Equity Project in early care and education, we've defined those to include suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, and restraint and seclusion. Each of these forms of discipline are allowed to be used with children birth to 8 or in their early care and early learning space. What we do know is that this starts early. It begins with infants and toddlers. Childcare is the least regulated for discipline. There is no evidence that these forms of discipline works. There's a host of negative effects, and we know the research show that it is largely driven by bias. We also are aware that our teachers are inadequately trained. We have some misguided policies and just an overall lack of support and resources. when it comes to discipline and using discipline. And to use discipline with this age group of children is the perception of what developmentally appropriate, and I use that very loosely, behavior, but behavior that is appropriate for the child's developmental age. And those behaviors are typically tantruming and, you know, what we see that teachers would find as problem behaviors or early care educators. And so, with this understanding of discipline, we all here today know some of those statistics and facts. So, I'm not going to get into data, but with my 10 minutes, I really want to focus in on policy recommendations and sort of practice recommendations to discipline. And overall, for policy in the early care and education space, President Obama era had released a lot of discipline guidance, particularly that limited exclusionary discipline and to address disparities. What we see in the discipline data currently is that rates of discipline is decreasing, and that's a great thing. But what we are not seeing is any closing of the gap between race and between subgroups with disabilities, children with disabilities. What we found that happened in 2015 was the Department of Ed and Human Health and Services and put out a policy statement which recommended that all states and early childhood programs establish policies to reduce and eventually eliminate exclusionary discipline. So once again, just only suspension and expulsion. Further on after that policy statement, Congress reauthorized our Child Care and Development Block Grant with new language that requires states to report to the federal government their policies on expulsion and suspension. As I mentioned, it's the least regulated in the child care space. Additionally, during this time, the Head Start performance standards were updated, which prohibits the use of suspension and expulsion in Head Start programs, Head Start and early Head Start. And then lastly, before his exit, the IDEA and equity rule was passed, which addresses the significant disproportionality of children with disabilities in discipline. And so these policies really set the tone for starting to address systemic racism and how we're using discipline with children of color. And what we at the Children Equity Project would like to see in terms of some solutions and some policy change is that we can continue to address the other areas of discipline as well. So get a federal ban on corporal punishment, right? We know that it is legal in the United States still in 19 states. We would also like to get a ban on the use of restraint and seclusion with young children. Don't really need to give you the reason why children birth to 5 particularly shouldn't be restrained, but no children. We also want to look at increasing funding for mental health interventions and personnel. So some things that Congress could do, or prioritize child health and positive discipline over punitive discipline. And some things that we would like to see the federal agencies could do is raise awareness about the negative impacts of harsh discipline and family rights, and to tie federal funds to states' progress, reducing harsh discipline and disparities in its use. Also, federal agencies could reinstate guidance that discourages the use of exclusionary discipline and address those racial disparities. In an area where states could be influential in policy change is to prohibit corporal punishment and seclusion and all those other forms of discipline at the state level, since we know there is no federal ban. States can invest in data systems and professional development and develop infrastructure to receive and investigate and act on parents' complaints. And another policy area when we think about the different levels is the closest level to children, and that is the district level. And districts also have the ability to do some of the things that Congress, federal agencies, and states can do, because they can ban harsh discipline in their district discipline codes of conduct. And they can ensure that young children never have negative interactions with school resource officers or feel intimidation or be subjected to harsh forms of discipline. And as we're thinking about sort of the policy that's led us here today to sort of decrease some of these rates, and we can continue to focus on the disparities, is address the bias that occurs mainly in discipline of children of color. A lot of the ways that we can do that the research shows has been effective is through infant and early childhood mental health consultation. But in this case, we do have emerging research that shows that the race of the consultant matters. So we just can only focus on early childhood mental health consultation. And then some other practice recommendations is what the previous speakers before me is thinking about humanizing pedagogy, particularly focusing on emotional development, anti-bias practices, and sort of the pyramid model PBIS, although we know that these models are not built with equity and infused with racial equity in them. And so there needs to be an equity, an infusion of equity throughout these models to ensure that they are culturally sensitive and linguistically sensitive. So now I'm going to go ahead and transition really quickly over to inclusion to just give a brief overview of what we would like to see when it comes to the inclusion of children with disabilities, particularly children of color. In general, the data show that children of color are underrepresented in early intervention and preschool special education, but yet they're overrepresented in K-12. And what that shows us is that young children of color are not receiving early interventions and supports. They're most likely being excluded from the learning environment through those forms of harsh discipline that I mentioned before. And additionally, we have to see when we're talking about inclusion of young children, we know that most children, infants, and toddlers receive their services in the home. So we don't see any disparities there. But we do know in preschool special education that even though there are no racial disparities in where children are placed, all of children, under 50% of them are included with their peers, regardless of race. And what we know is from 1985 to about 2015, and probably these last 5 years, there's only been about a 5.7% increase in inclusion. And what we know is that access has definitely increased through preschool, state-sponsored preschool and Head Start, but inclusion is not occurring and it's not happening for these children. Some of the cited barriers to inclusion, of course, are teachers and administrators' attitudes and beliefs, sort of a lack of self-efficacy to teach children with disabilities, perceived policy or financial barriers, a lack of workforce preparation, uncoordinated services and systems, and a lack of oversight. In addition to with children with disabilities, we think about placement, we think about inclusion, but also there are disparities in identification. In the school age we are able to disaggregate those out by disability categories, but not so much in early intervention and preschool. So early intervention, there's not really a difference. And in preschool, the majority of children are either developmentally delayed or they have a speech delay. But when these children transition into school age, we find that Black children are more than 2 times as likely to be identified as intellectual disability or emotional disturbance. And intellectual disability is often determined by diagnostic tools that we know historically are not normed with children of color. And then we also have this emotional disturbance, and we really need to reconceptualize how we view Black children's behavior and their identification for emotional disturbance. These categories were really key to the history of separate but equal and desegregation orders. It was a different way for the system to use special education as a way to segregate Black children away. And we know that children identified with certain disabilities are segregated away and are not included with their peers. So just really quickly there, we know we have IDEA. We know that in 2015, the Department of Ed and Health and Human Services reaffirmed their commitment to inclusion and put out inclusion statements. They put out guidance on general education and the least restrictive environment. And then we have the equity and IDEA rule that addresses significant disproportionalities in placement and identification of children with disabilities, particularly children of color. I do want to note that the definition of an inclusion classroom is 50% children with disabilities and 50% children without. We do know that the research show that there are normal ratios of children, and that particular 50% ratio may not be the most effective ratio when we're thinking of inclusion. To get into some practices, I see that my time might be running out here. I see my this slide is up. But to get into some practices, really some recommendations is definitely for Congress to fully fund IDEA. It should have been funded at 40%, but it is only at 18%. And I'm going to speed up and skip to the document that's here. This document that's shown on the screen is 14 priorities to dismantle systemic racism in early care and education. We put this together as a bold reform that will address equity in access, equity in experiences, and outcomes as well. And we use these strategies not to operate in isolation, but to bring about change with families and advocates, along with governments, putting together key equity strategic plans to address equity throughout. Lastly, here I want to touch on my individual work where I train early childhood educators using practice-based coaching, which is the key components there is the self-reflection to reflect on how we're using practices with Black children, how to reflect on bias, and to understand what our responses are doing and sharing emotional experiences with Black children. There's a lot of emphasis on social and emotional development. And with the work that we do, we're looking to address the groundwater as well as address effective curriculum, pedagogy, and anti-bias that addresses the anti-Blackness that Dr. Boutte mentioned earlier, and also some of the things that the previous speaker offered. And if I think I've run out of time, I'll stop there. And I have questions for anyone at the end.
So, hello, everybody, and thank you to the 3 previous speakers. I learned a lot already listening from your talk. I'm going to be talking about a research project that was conducted in Toronto, Ontario. Can we talk about race, confronting color blindness in early childhood settings? We had a wonderful research team, including my colleagues, Alana Butler and Beverly Jean Daniel, and 3 fantastic research assistants, Maggie McNevin, Rabina Quadri, and Natalie Royer, who are all registered early childhood educators. And we conducted this project between 2014 and 2016. I'd also like to mention that I am really honored to be here today to be part of this panel and to engage in some unlearning as well, what Dr. Murray mentioned previously. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a little bit of context. You may not know that, or you may, there's no national early childhood education and care program or policy framework in Canada. The 10 provinces and 3 territories have developed their own approaches. It's really patchwork: childcare, nursery school, kindergarten. Each province or territory has an assortment of programs provided through multiple departments and authorities. And K-12 is completely separate, and there's no federal body, no national ministry that has any kind of coherent approach to education. So it's really up to each province. Something else I want to mention is that there's really a myth that Canada is this lovely multicultural society and that we're very tolerant and racism somehow doesn't exist in Canada is the dominant discourse. A scholar, Stewart, describes colorblindness as the Canadian condition, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the theory of colorblind racism. The idea that racial inequality exists simultaneously in a world that holds on to the idea that race and racism is no longer relevant. So we wanted to look at race in an early childhood context, and we employed the frameworks of critical race theory, post-structuralism, colorblind racism, and the sociology of childhood to examine a number of research questions. The first one being, what strategies or materials do early childhood educators use to discuss or not discuss race with children? What discourses about race and racial identities are employed by children by early childhood educators? How does race factor into children's play? How is race positioned in Ontario policy and curriculum documents? Who benefits from the use of certain discourses and who is disadvantaged, and what recommendations could be made? So we carried out interviews with 21 children, which we had children draw themselves, draw a friend, talk about their hair, talk about their eyes, talk about their skin color. This was based on some work that had been done previously in Australia by Glenda McNaughton. And we also did 14 participant observations of children's play episodes. And we interviewed early childhood professionals, and these were people that were in the classroom or managers or had some kind of connection to the early childhood sector. And the thing that I'm going to talk about today now, and if you could move to the next slide, please, is what we found when we talked to the early childhood educators. So we, in all the many interview questions we asked, and we spent probably about an hour with each participant, a few hours, we're an hour and a half. One of the interview questions asked about the reporting of what were called racial incidents as required by the City of Toronto Children's Services Division, which at the time there are about 600 childcare centers connected to the City of Toronto. And since 1998, the City of Toronto Children's Services Division had a policy that required all licensed childcare centers to report what they called any racial incident as a serious occurrence. However, in our research, we found that in all that time, right up to when we were doing the interviews in 2015, only one case of a serious occurrence had ever been filed. So we wanted to understand how the early childhood professionals we were talking with understood racial incidents and how they described reasons for not reporting them. I should mention too that participants were asked to self-identify, not select a predetermined category in regard to gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality. And the majority identified as white. One identified as mixed, one I didn't identify their race, but identified their ethnicity as Hispanic, another identified as Italian, and we had 2 participants who identified as Black. Generally, they had been in the field, some about 20 years, and were in the 40 to 50 age range. So we found that the educators engaged in discursive acts of minimizing and negating the existence of racist interactions and incidents in early learning settings. They talked in ways that this racist incident was a one-time incident. They minimized the severity by saying things such as, oh, it was just that one little thing, or there might be small things, or they talked about not really being able to remember very clearly. Some were surprised that we even asked the question, why would you even ask about that? It's not even relevant. So a few of the participants' answers also hinted that they had witnessed racial incidents, but then they would backtrack. One participant reported that what could have been a child's negative response to a Black staff member, but explained the child's actions towards the staff member by saying, well, it's just a personal thing. He just doesn't like her. We heard different stories, of course, from the 2 Black early childhood professionals who talked about their frustration and lack of support. So really there was a strong commitment to discourses of silence, discourses of sameness. And, what we found was that the early child professionals we talked to really had little training. So I'm thinking about what Dr. Catherine was saying about lack of adequate training around discipline. What we found was that the people we spoke with were quite clear that they had really not had any kind of training about how to talk to children or their colleagues or families around specific incidents of race. Thank you. Next slide, please. So some of our recommendations included, obviously, re-examining ECE program curriculum. What are early childhood professionals being taught in their curriculum? Where, next bullet, please. If you could, that we need to include specific courses on race, how to handle race-based incidents, that we need to have professional development with those already in the field. It's crucial. We need to constantly challenge racial invisibility. We need to work with policymakers, but we can see that it wasn't enough to have a policy around reporting this as a serious occurrence, because nothing, got reported. We heard there was nothing or almost nothing to report. So we need to also make sure that we're doing our job, talking about race and how to talk about race with white early childhood educators, and talking more about and reading more about anti-Black racism, and including that information and that research, and how important, as Dr. Boutte talked about, that loving Black children is. And we also argue that our findings have some relevance for those that are in the field, as I mentioned. So I guess the last bullet would be, if you could click one more time, Margarita, if you please. What will you do next? So just to think about, this may not be surprising. These findings may seem like same old, same old. So what do we need to do? We need to take steps. We need to change our practice, whether we're educating early childhood educators or we're in the field working with children and families. It's time to rethink what we're doing and make changes so that all children can feel welcome and thrive. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Mariana Souto-Manning from stolen Lenape land, otherwise known as New York City. I want to start by holding space for my colleague, Dr. Gloria Boutte, whose work is absolutely brilliant, and really to offer my regrets that you weren't able to really witness her full brilliance in her presentation, but do get her book, please. My presentation today is a work in progress. It's an opportunity for me to think aloud with you. I have been thinking about how to interrupt, to upend the trauma that our children, that our families, that our communities experience, without re-traumatizing ourselves, without re-traumatizing our children, because they have been traumatized. We have been re-traumatized for far too long. This is because in the US and globally, anti-Black racism is pervasive and ingrained. Common racial microaggressions we hear are, where are you from? Where are you really from? And if you look like me, no, where are you really, really from? Where are your people from? Your name is so hard to pronounce. Can I call you Mary or Mariana? You speak English so well. What are your people? Think about that. These are everyday sights that re-traumatize those of us who are dark. Yet, how do we counter such trauma, such racial microaggressions? How do we abolish them? This is a question I am asked a lot. So today, I invite you to shift your paradigm. Amid so much talk about equity and inclusion and diversity, I invite you to shift your focus to prioritize Black and Brown joy, justice, and belonging. This requires moving beyond the intrapersonal and interpersonal, really, which often entails self and self-discovery, the biases, as well as racist actions and interactions, what we have come to know as macroaggressions. These, after all, only comprise a veneer of diversity, which at best affords our marginal inclusion to conceptualizations of diversity, which are often predicated on how we approximate or pass as white, how we contort ourselves to pass, and how we harm ourselves in the process, physically, emotionally, psychologically, when we do so. Instead, I want us to think about how we, in our classrooms and schools, in formal and in informal education settings, can promote Black and Brown justice, joy, belonging by design intentionally via micro affirmations. These, I believe, has the potential to help us abolish the everyday borderings, which are invisible to those of us who occupy positions of privilege and whose identity align and project with the dominant identity with whiteness while being palpable obstacles to those of us who are dark. With the goal of a society where everyday borderings that project and protect the project of whiteness can be abolished, and where liberation, freedom, and humanity, our humanity, is centered. How? One way I'm currently engaging with these is by diminishing our focusing on countering microaggressions and instead fostering, cultivating, and sustaining racial microaffirmations. Now, before you dismiss microaffirmations as being small, which is what I often hear, because instead of reading the work, sometimes we just want to go by the title. Let's revisit the original work by Chester Pierce, who defined microaggressions over 40 years ago as everyday, routine, and therefore micro put-downs. Building on the work of Dr. Pierce, Dennis Olórzano and Lindsay Perez-Uber conceptualized racial microaggressions as one form of systemic racism used to keep those at the margin of society in their perceived place. These are visible when we, people of color, feel out of place because of our race, when our teachers have low expectations of us, or issue judgments about our families that are not generous at best, and when we experience subtle and not so subtle racial discrimination, such as, oh, there is a spill in the elevator, can you please go clean up? Those are microaggressions that we experience every single day. So Ryerson and Perez-Uber proposed in their latest book, their 2020 book, that critical race theory is a way of responding to everyday instances of racism. To do so, they explain that a racial microaggression analysis should include an examination of the structural conditions leading to and continuing to produce and reproduce everyday racism, to delve beyond the symptoms of racism, and to acknowledge the disease of white supremacy. They wrote that history teaches us that resistance is born of struggle. It is thus critical to examine and understand the many forms of racism in our society, but it's just as important, if not more, to recognize and name how our people, how people of color have responded to it throughout history. In doing so, we honor the many ways and the many forms of resistance of communities of color who have engaged in challenging and transforming racism and really work to affirm the dignity and humanity of ourselves and the resistance that it demands. Yet, departing from racial microaggressions, they coined the concept of racial microaffirmations, everyday forms of affirmation and validation that people of color engage in a variety of public and private settings. The nods, the smiles, the embraces, the use of language and other actions that express acknowledgement, respect, self-worth, belonging, I see you. Racial microaffirmations are the subtle verbal or nonverbal strategies that people of color engage that we use to affirm each other's dignity, integrity, and shared humanity. These moments of shared cultural intimacy allow us to feel acknowledged, respected, valued in a society that constantly and perpetually seeks to dehumanize us. This is where I believe we must shift our gaze. As such, I ask, how can childhood educators center racial microaffirmations in their approach, practices, paradigms, and communities? To be sure, people can be affirmed by engaging in activities that remind us of who we are fully, truly. Those qualities that are central to how we see ourselves. In a difficult situation, reminders of these values can provide us with the perspective to anchor ourselves with a sense of a place to really reinscribe and reclaim our self-integrity, even in the face of threat. This self-affirmation makes salient one of these important core qualities of identity. It is with the aim of fostering racial affirmations that I offer a few examples of micro affirmations in teaching within the context of early childhood classrooms. So the first example is names. Legal scholar Margaret Montoya and her use of language and storytelling has been since 1994, used to call in Latinx communities to engage with legal scholarship. Building on Montoya's work, Solórzano and Pérez Uber argue that this is indeed a pedagogical strategy of racial microaffirmation. So Montoya's work with colleagues was on name narratives. A name narrative is a classroom practice that prompts students of color to explore their family histories, acknowledge their cultural capital, and understand how their life experiences are mediated by social structures. I have done this in collaboration with New York City public school teacher Jessica Martel when students interviewed family members about the history and meaning of their names, learning about themselves and about each other in the process. Name narratives as pedagogy are strategies that affirm cultures and experiences and humanities of students of color in the classroom, a space when they're often marginalized. This is one example from many existing critical pedagogies used by educators within and beyond the field of education. As you consider possibilities, I hope you will work to explore and name other pedagogies. Here's an example of a tool that can be used to foster microaffirmations. Your Name is a Song, where author Jamila Tompkins Bigelow invites us to consider how many of our names come from dreamers, as our names and the names of our ancestors were stolen long ago, and we dreamed of new ones. Jamila Tompkins Bigelow has a video on YouTube that serves as a model of how to engage in microaffirmations in the classroom through the pronunciation of names.
Hello, my name is Jamila Tompkins Bigelow, and I am the author of Your Name is a Song. Today I'm going to pronounce the many names that are in the book Your Name is a Song. These are common pronunciations for the names. However, please note, someone might have one of these names, but pronounce it quite differently. Please always take the time to listen to how someone pronounces their own name. If you're not sure, be sure to ask them. Let them know that it is important to you to get their name right. Let's begin. Ahlam, Ahlam. Anderson, Anderson. Benjamin, Benjamin. Bilqis, Bilqis.
Another example of microaffirmations in teaching is the centering of our histories and of our families' histories. This is essential as much of the history and social studies taught by the dominant curriculum serve as sites of microaggression, inflicting microinvalidations and silencing us, our people, and our history. So affirming that everyone has a history, as the late Julius Lester affirmed in Let's Talk About Race, means that we must commit to centering our histories in our classrooms, the histories of those who make up the classroom, their families, their communities, as well as their silenced histories. This can be done, for example, via an oral history project, whereby children interview family members about their stories. Here you see a photo of Amelia and her dad being interviewed in Jessica Martel's second grade classroom in a New York City public school around the day that she was born, her birthday, when her story started within the context of the family. Yet another example of microaffirmations can occur via books by and about Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. Here we return to Jessica's classroom, where each year she engaged her students in an outer study of an author of color. Here you see Rafael Trujillo, a Boricua author, signing a book. This is a site of microaffirmation. It is important to note that sites of microaffirmation or teaching that foster, cultivate, and sustain microaffirmations often do not simply happen. They require love, as Dr. Gloria Boutte talked about. We need to be loving Black children, our children. But this love is not simply a feeling. As Bell Hooks underscored, love is an action, never simply a feeling. As such, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination and oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action here, the action of microaffirmations, is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. So as we remember that there can be no love without justice, may we commit to fostering justice through racial affirmations in our education of young children. Here, I offer a beginning framework for racial justice via racial microaffirmations in the education of young children. First, we need to make sure that we attend to our child development paradigms and center the knowledge, the development of Black, Indigenous, and of children of color. Then we need to attend to racially just pedagogies. This means considering, how are my pedagogies sustaining racial justice? How are my teaching materials, my curriculum centering Black, Indigenous, people of color images? How are ways of making meaning and making sense in BIPOC communities, practices and values positioned in teaching? Finally, it is important that we abandon accountability measures that are standardized and have been created to protect whiteness and uphold white supremacy, having roots in eugenics. This means shifting from accountability systems to answerability to communities. For this to happen, we need to center BIPOC voices, values, and expertise, centering the rights of Black, Indigenous, and children of color to be children. Ensuring their practices are centered, fostering their belonging, sustaining their full humanity, shifting from the priorities of white educators to those in Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. They are our best teachers and our best teacher educators. All right, I hope I have given you some ways to shift your focus from the aggressions we, our children, and our communities withstand day in and day out to affirming us, our ways of being, communicating, and ultimately our full humanity. My hope is that you will recommit to countering microaggressions while fostering, cultivating, and sustaining microaffirmations in and through your teaching, thereby centering joy, love, humanity for all children, families, and communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Souto-Manning, and thank you everyone from the panel. I want to acknowledge that I had some technical issues that I didn't anticipate to happen. I want to apologize to Dr. Boutte for the issues that happened, especially during her presentation. Her work is amazing, and I'm inspired to read more about what you do and how you do it. Thank you so much. And now it is the time for the Q&A.
Hi, so this is Lacey, and I just see, one Amy Clark has their hand raised. So Amy, if you would like to ask your question, please do so now. Amy, was there a question you wanted to ask? Okay, we'll come back to you later. Liz M, I see your hand is also raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question next? Okay, we'll also come back to you, or you can add your question. Should check all the boxes. Rachel Langford, please unmute yourself and ask next. Let's try maybe.
I think we may just need to use the Q&A function. I've been scrolling through mostly comments, but and commendations to our speakers, but there might be a question or two there. So if you can, until we switch to salon format, use the Q&A, that would be so helpful. Thanks.
So it appears that folks cannot unmute themselves to ask their questions. I wonder if before you all switch to the salon formats, if you have a question you'd like to ask, just type in the Q&A. That way the panelists and the organizers can address your question instead of these. Technology is great. We are in Ireland, in New Zealand, in the US, and so many other places. At the same time, it does have its challenges.
Yes, indeed. And this is our first, so we are definitely embracing all of the learning opportunities. So again, apologies for these technical glitches, but I do see a question in the box, thanks to Steffi Wright. I think this is something addressed to all the panelists. She asks, or they asks, I am curious about how racism shows up in communities where the caregivers are Black or Latino. How does racial trauma impact guidance?
I'll get started because I'm going to have to go teach and hopefully others can chime in. But I think that as Dr. Boutte mentioned, anti-Black racism is global. And also Blackness is not solely within the context of the US. So I think that in a lot of Latinx communities, once you immigrate, whether it is to the US, to the UK, to New Zealand, then you become one group. And that tends to essentialize and erase some of the variations of being Afro-Latina against someone who is a white Latina. So it's important for us to think about how, in a lot of ways, in trying to pass because of opportunities, and there are lots of scholarship about that, there is this approximation of whiteness, and Zeus Leonardo writes quite a bit about it in terms of thinking about how you are never going to become, but like how there's some benefits there. And I see that for young children a lot. And that really, in my research, has shown two possibilities. One of them is an attempt of erasure. of trying to distance themselves from family members who are darker or who speak Spanish. The other one is trying to assimilate. And, you know, that has been long standing. I mean, W.B. Du Bois wrote about the veil. Carter G. Woodson wrote about internalized racism. So racism is pervasive, ingrained, and ordinary. We're breathing it, we're swimming in it, however you want to use it. And so it does exist in Latinx communities and Black communities. And a lot of times when we are advocating with families, we have to walk this fine line, especially with immigrant families. Do we want to do what they are saying because they think that that's the right thing to say, or are we actually helping them develop a critical analysis of this system that is keeping racist structures in place? So I know there's a much more complicated answer and question, but I would say that part of the work is really thinking about how everyone is implicated and everyone is complicit, and how we have to, if you think about a river and white supremacy being that very powerful river, if we do nothing, we go with the current. So to be neutral in a moving current of white supremacy is to side with white supremacy. So we have to always work against it, even to stay in the same place. And that applies to Latinx communities, as well as white communities and Black communities and colorism.
I would like just to hop in there and piggyback off of what Dr. Souto-Manning said. It was really powerful. In my research, I actually had Black educators and Black children, and found that through self-reflection, that depending on the identity of that Black early childhood educator, with how they responded to Black boys. And so, for example, one of my teachers identified as Black, but she was biracial. She's both Black and white. She was raised by her white side of her family. So she perceived Blackness and masculinity in a certain way based on her socialization. And then my other teacher was an Eastern Caribbean, or from Trinidad, and she wasn't familiar with Black American culture. And then one of the children in the classroom was a continental African. His parents were from Ghana, and they didn't understand disability and development and intervention in the American context. And so I think, to Dr. Souto-Manning's point, we all experience it, and self-reflection is a really, really key part of what a lot of our early educators do not get the opportunity in this space to do, and to reflect on how they're responding, and maybe have someone observing their behavior to be able to communicate their behavior through observation.
Well, thank you. We'll ask a next question. This one, I think it's coming up pretty frequently in the question box, and it's the questions being raised in different transnational contexts, but the essence of the question is about, or is asked in maybe this fashion: how can early care and educators talk about race with a classroom that might be fairly homogeneous and or predominantly white? Again, I think that's a question that perhaps all of the panelists.
I'll start. Yeah, I think it's especially important in white environments. I mentioned it briefly. You know, a while back, Louise Derman-Sparks and Patricia Ramsey had a book, What If All the Children Are White? But what's happening in those settings is several things. One, the children are not learning to address their own racial identities. Two, they're learning inaccurate information about other people of color, and they're learning the rules of white supremacy. So unless, you know, there's conversation, these racism won't be interrupted. And we also should think about intersectionalities. In other words, is it really homogeneous? There are lots of other, lots of diversity among even all white students, for example. One way I would suggest several things. One, there should never be a one-time presentation. This needs to be ongoing professional development. And I have found it helpful to have a framework to guide the work, including helping people understand that discomfort is part of healing, and part of the process, and also understanding our own social identities as well as systemic racism, and learning to recognize that and how we contribute in our policies and our practices. One book that I think is very user-friendly for educators and families alike, and even teens, is Tiffany Jewell's book, This Book is Anti-Racist. And what it does, it gives the reader a chance to reflect on their social identities, reflect on examples of systemic inequities in their everyday life. So I think that's my answer.
I want to thank everyone. I think now it's time to go back to Dr. Southerner and Dr. Block. Mimi, Beth, if you please.
Well, thank you. Virtual applause, big virtual hugs that we still can't quite give each other across the miles and the pandemic spaces that separate us. But the panel, I'm sure all that participated agree, has really exceeded our hopes for this session, which is part of a series of 3 virtual workshops or forums addressing injustices and how they intersect with our opportunities in early childhood context. So a very big thanks. And to you, really, Margarita did some pretty heavy lifting, managing as many things as she just did. And I want to appreciate her so much. In response, and some of you will now start to leave, and we know that, and the formal part of the program is formally ending. But as they're leaving, I want to remind you that what's coming next is a little experiment, little RECE experiment in offering a more interactive informal salon. This came up at our virtual business meeting, which was last month, and you requested just some time to maybe with any speakers who can stay on a bit longer, continue the dialogue. It also will open up panel privileges. You'll be able to see each other. You'll be able to post in the chat, and certainly we can socialize a bit. So that's what's going to happen. In a minute or two, I will, Mimi Block and I will sort of get the signal that those who are staying for the salon are with us, and then we will open things up to that dialogue. I know it'll take just a minute, and I'll look to Jana for a signal on that.
I'd like to just, if I can, to
please. I was just going to turn it over to you, Mimi.
Well, just to, first of all, thank all the speakers so very, very much. I'm not teaching anymore, but I've taken a lot of notes here for future classes, whatever, I don't know. But I've learned a great deal myself, and I have been challenged a great deal. I hope everybody who's still on here, even those who've left, have benefited from all the wisdom that you've all shared with us. And we are going to the virtual salon, but I hope if there's any last remark by any panelist who has to leave, or any question for any panelist, that you take that opportunity right away before you have to leave. It's been such a joy to listen to the presentations, but I'd also like to hear the listeners, if they have any questions, please stay on, and panelists who are able to stay right in the beginning may be able to respond to some more questions. Let's switch to everybody being able to be a panelist.